Thank you. Our next speaker is A.G. Krishna Menon. He made a point at lunch of talking about how, though he was trained in the university, he is now operating outside of the university, which gives him, certainly in this room, and also I think in other contexts, a unique perspective, and we are looking forward very much to hearing it. He's an architect, urban planner, and conservation consultant who's been working in New Delhi for over 40 years. Trained in architecture from the Indian Institute of Technology with graduate degrees from the Illinois Institute of Technology and from Columbia. He's published extensively and has served on many governmental committees related to the urban planning of New Delhi, most notably its master plan conducted between 2001 and 2021. So it's a pleasure to have him here to speak about the rationale for an Indian charter to conserve the built heritage.
Thank you, Peter, for inviting me here. As I was telling you earlier, that such debates don't take place in India too often. And I really value the fact that we are here to argue about things that we should be arguing about back home, because we have a lot of problems and we just seem to be getting along. So thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to discuss some of them. I have a strange problem because what I'm about to say has already been said by other speakers. A lot of it has been said by other speakers. And in fact, I had anticipated that and I had structured it wrongly because I thought that I'd go over the ground and go towards the end and add what I had to add. Now I find that, I have to go to the end first and add and focus on that. But my presentation is not based on that. It's based on the fact that I'm talking from the beginning, and a lot of what I have to say may already have been said, but it'll lead to a rationale for conservation. And that rationale for conservation really comes because of the metaphor that, we have this charters that guide our thinking. Who writes the charters? What are they based on, etc. And that struck me very much as an outsider, that who told me to do all this? Why don't we look at our own cultural production and say, okay, the charter should be based on the cultural production and it should be preserved according to how it was produced. So these are kind of some of the thoughts that that motivated me to make this presentation. So my presentation really has three parts. There's a prequel, just an introduction to why I'm saying what I'm saying, and there'll be also a coda, an end, by the problems. Both have been dealt with, but maybe with my own perspective. So as I said, the built heritage is everywhere a product of local histories, but the dominant discourses on how to conserve are defined by Eurocentric philosophies and cultural developments. In India, this incongruity has created profound paradoxes, and we've heard of some of those paradoxes in earlier discussions. The Eurocentric conservation ideology was introduced to protect iconic Indian monuments by the colonial government about 150 years ago. Not that it was tabula rasa. There was a thriving cultural production and conservation going on. But suddenly 150 years ago, the entire system changed because of colonialism. And the ideology that, and this change was also based on a very insidious idea of civilizing. The colonial project was about civilizing the native. And so it was rather ironic that we are being civilized, a 2,000-year-old cultural system is being civilized. And that's exactly what happened. And what got into the civilization was the Eurocentric idea that, this is the right way of doing things. What you are doing was wrong. And there have been lots written about it. I don't have to go into it. But in art history, there have been a lot of discussion on this. This ideology evolved, has now become the universal ideology, and which is what UNESCO and ICOMOS and all talk about. So the irony is that even as we have modernized and we talk about UNESCO and ICOMOS, the civilizing mission continues. And we are still dealing with an other, which is us, Means we do conservation as we're conserving the other. And that's how I was taught to conserve. Look at the object as an object, objectively. Don't look at it as subjectively. But yet it's a product of a subjective mind, subjective. And now how do I reconcile that is part of the issues that I'm talking about, the Indian rationale. The ironies of this also is the idea that there's a one-way flow of ideas. The West is not interested in me. They're not wanting to know what I have to tell them. But I have to be interested in what the West has to tell me because they are civilizing me. So these are some of the prequel I'm talking about, is still not my presentation, that led me to talk about an Indian, the rationale for an Indian conservation charter. The universal doctrines are considered value neutral, and yet I find they're not value neutral. They're being profoundly divisive. They divide the orthodox from the modern, the traditional from the contemporary. And this is not a value neutral process of conservation. So one is right, one is wrong, etc. So, and it's also presented to me as a scientific process, as to say what was done earlier was not scientific. It was a certain traditional process which is not considered science. So we find that these are all ironies that now strike us as something is how to deal with it. And we are beginning to deal with it, as some of the speakers have said, that the problems are surfacing. There's a bewildering complexity of traditions and heritage in all in India. So it cannot be scientifically or universally controlled or managed. So how do you deal with the bewildering complexities? In what way? And that's, again, one of the reasons why this rationale of the Indian conservation system is. And I'll just identify a few of these diversities. Demography. My God, it's a massive urbanization, overwhelming any planned development, any planned idea. If I have an idea of conserving, there'll be a huge alternative presented. As one of the sayings in India is that the opposite is also true in India. So under those circumstances, what ideology would I want to present? Second, poverty. There's persistent poverty. And yet, entire idea of conservation is based on the fact that we are a stable society, we have resources, we want to conserve, because we now have elevated ourselves from scarcity and need. And conservation is a product of the fact that as a society, we have got out of that rut and we are now going to conserve. But yet, poverty is persistent and almost seems intractable. History. It's also based on the fact that we agree on history. But my God, in India, we don't agree on history. There's provocatively contentious. History is provocatively contentious in India. So if as a conservator, I say, well, this is a historical fact, this is what we got to do, there'll be other points of views. And we've heard speakers talk about those problems earlier. Sociology is a deeply stratified society. So who am I conserving for? Am I conserving for myself as an elite? For others? For whom? So it's an enormously stratified society. So who am I addressing? Who am I representing? Culture is deeply rooted. So the civilizing machine, when it came and said that I must civilize this way, but it's a deeply rooted culture. It has not been erased. 150 years of colonization has not erased it. Yes, my facility to speak in English, think in English, talk to English, and communicate in English has been enormously facilitated due to colonization. But otherwise, I am still deeply rooted to my culture. How do I reconcile that? That this facility that I can articulate, think like a Westerner, but still act like an Easterner, how do I reconcile that? And politics, my God, that is something that came up in one or two discussions. We have a robust democracy. Robust means really, it's almost comical sometimes how robust it is. It is not the, shall we say, the Westminster type of democracy, the rule of law. We rule by law, not rule of law. We create laws to, and that's democratic, because it's created democratically. So I'm saying these are the kind of diversities we're going to deal with. And yet, we are also governed by the fact that we want to modernize. as a society, the aspiration to modernize and the strategies to urgently develop the political economy are rooted in the colonial antecedents, but they're all rooted in the colonial antecedents. They're told me to uncritically, they have an uncritical propensity to mimic Eurocentric models, whether it's city planning, architecture, and even conservation ideology. I've got to mimic the Eurocentric models of development. Is deeply rooted bias in decision-making that views the imperatives of development and conservation as binaries. Now, we all know as intelligent people that they're not binaries. They're all interrelated. But colonialism, if I were to tell you about the history of how it happened, very clear how to rule, they had to separate. And the idea of development and conservation are two different entities, two different objectives, has been deeply rooted. And thirdly, and most importantly, we intuitively disparage the characteristics of indigenous urbanism. So indigenous culture is disparaged because colonial culture disparaged it. Modernity was something that was not indigenous. So I have to contend with that. So these are some of the things that as a prequel, I think I've got one or two other points. We are blind to the significance of the contemporary salience of millennia-old practices of building construction and maintenance that continues to serve the contemporary needs of society. So we may say that conservation, that tradition is dead. It is not dead. I think one or two presentations showed that it's very much alive. The interesting story that in 1911, when the British were building a new capital in India, Delhi, some people said, let's use traditional craftsmen. And in 1911, they said, no, there are no traditional craftsmen. We've been ruling this country for so long that there are no traditional craftsmen around. That was 1911. We're still seeing the same thing in 2022, that there are no traditional craftsmen. But they are all around the place, but we're just blind to it. And the question is, how do you bring them into the discourse? And I'm sorry, I'm not doing the correct thing. I am not too good at this technology, but it's just this. These practices have evolved to offer credible options because the traditions still are there. It's amazing how much development is taking place outside the system, but we are blind to it. We call it illegal. We call it, not worthy of further consideration. But if you look at it, it's serving the needs of society. And this is the quality of indigenous urbanism, because most of our cities are planned cities, but yet even in a place like Delhi, which is a very rich city, very well planned, very tightly controlled, they say 70% of Delhi is illegal. It's been just constructed illegally. So one has to begin to think that what is planning, what is indigenous urbanism, and how do you reconcile the two? However, and this is the fact of the matter, that I cannot have one instead of the other, because both Eurocentric and indigenous ideologies are relevant to the Indian mind, to the Indian imagination. So it reflects what you might call Janus-faced duality of the cultural characteristics of contemporary society. We're not a unitary. I can't say that this is Indian idea. There are several Indian ideas. It's traditional and modern. So it's a Janus-faced duality that must determine policy. The rationale to formulate the Indian Charter is based on overcoming this predicament. So this was really a prequel. And the rest I can really go through quite fast because people have already mentioned it. There's an existing paradigm, the significance of the living heritage. I think Binamol talked about it. It's there very much in practice. They build, repair, add, etc. Quite happily, even though the archaeological survey is saying they're wrong, don't do it. But this is happening throughout the country. In fact, there's another interesting statistic that, I'm a modern architect, but it was sobering to think that we modern architects do less than 10% of the building in India. Who does the 90%? Who does the 90%? These are the people who do the 90%. So yet we seem to dominate the discourse. We say, well, this is what Indian policy should be. And as a modern architect, I have to come to realize that, I'm just dealing with about 10% of the building in the country. 90% is being done by many other ways of building. What are these ways of building? I think we got to come to terms with it. And they build, they restore, they repair, they add, they rebuild quite happily, quite satisfactorily, and without any loss of significance. Now, the major characteristics of this traditional system that we've talked about, but I'll just highlight them. One is to seamlessly repair, modify, add to historic buildings. And now that seems to be the tradition. If I say that 90 or 80% or 70% of the buildings, they do that, I have to come to terms with it. I can't just say that's wrong, wrong, wrong. Don't do it. The right way of doing it is not to seamlessly repair. I go to follow the Venice Charter that says you must distinguish the new and the old, etc. So it would not make any sense. Imitation was, in fact, the skill to be valued. A craftsman would come and say, well, can you tell the difference between this and that? And we say, no, but that's wrong. You're copying. Copying is wrong. That's not right. Morally not right, ethically not right, and really practically not right. But yet, that's the skill of the craftsman. The local societies attach no cultural value to maintaining the physical fabric of the building, and we were told that in the full richness of the authenticity. Earlier speakers have spoken about it. Now, the architecture intent of the builder and the building was important. As Kavita also talked about, those temples being rebuilt, the intent of the builder was important. How it was constructed was important. And that seemed to be authentic. That added authenticity to it. Some examples of it are things like, just to illustrate the point, it implies that the historic site is more important than the building. A building may go, but the site is important. So you rebuild on the same site and it's as important. And here's an example of a ritual that takes place in Udaipur, where after some function, you go to have a bath in a pond. There's no water in the pond. So they still go to that place, bring a water tanker and have a bath, a ritual bath. And they feel that they're as sanctified, and they're as, they fulfill their purpose. Or in another case, a temple is gone, but yet the worshippers come to worship. And they're still worshipping in this because the site is important. That is where the temple was, and that's where it was being worshipped. Now, how do I use this as an idea to conserve? Now, what happened? So, again, Binamol talked about the fact that the attitude derived from a cyclical view of time. It defined the principle of Jirnodharan, and the local societies believed that governed the natural life cycles of buildings. Yes, we talked about this. And the cultural ethics that define the traditional ways of building and of repairing heritage buildings constitute the deep structure of Indian civilization that are embedded in the cultural imagination of contemporary society. So if I were to write a charter for the Indian work, I'll have to take these into consideration. Now, the facts of the matter, that 20 years ago, a traditional building could be built. These are Sompuras in Gujarat. They build temples. They're still building it in the middle of New Delhi, a modern city. So these practices are still going on, and very much, and they have larger practices than most architects and most modern architects. And we talked about traditional buildings. There are at least half a dozen traditional systems in India. Binamol talked about the southern system. Kavita talked about the Tamil Nadu system. Now these are Gujarat people. Then there's in Orissa, then the Northeast, you name it, that over half a dozen systems of traditional building. Each of them are robust, and each of them are able to build new buildings exactly the way they were built earlier. Now, why did it all change? Because of the Eurocentric heritage as a civilizing mission. Who are these people? And I like this photograph because it sort of symbolizes that civilizing mission. Here come people in their suit and boots coming and telling you what to do. So here's John Marshall, the first Director General of Archaeological Survey of India, who wrote the guidelines and to preserve Indian monuments. What are they based on? Again, we talked about it, Ruskin, William Morris, etc. And this constitutes a conservation ideology that we were taught and which we practice. And it represents the linear view of time, that everything has to be conserved in the full richness of its authenticity. And so we preserve a ruin as a ruin. The ASF preserves in a very pedantic way. I'm quite clear that Europe has moved on, but the ASI still practices this pedantic way of conserving, as Naveen Piplani showed very clearly, that ideas are moved on, but the ASI will still say no, 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 because they're still living 100 years ago. And they were taught 100 years ago by John Marshall, don't do this, and they still will not do it. So this is something that, and again, another iconic photograph, how the archaeologists were taught. You can see the power differences, you can see the social differences, you can see the cultural differences, and how you get civilized. Now, the core belief is now so deeply internalized that when in 2010, as part of the 150th anniversary celebration, the ASI proposed to revise the conservation guidelines compiled by John Marshall and introduce new perspectives revealed by post-colonial scholarship on the management of the built heritage, they ended up essentially reaffirming their fealty to the colonial laws. So that's how deeply ingrained it is. It was a wonderful opportunity in the 150th year of anniversary to say, okay, now let's relook at these laws. Let's see what we can do now. But when they started considering it, they went back to the same old guidelines. They ignored the significance of indigenous practices, except as an instrumental tool. The craftsman is still used purely instrumentally, not for his thinking, not for his skill, not for his knowledge, but as a skill. And they avoided all radical engaging with the paradigm shifts in conservation. The Archaeological Survey of India is an arm of the government, so everything is official. And as India modernizes and gets networked into the global institution, the traditional systems will inexorably get wiped out. So because the government is powerful, their ideas will prevail. And slowly, you can imagine, as it happened in the rest of the world, the traditional system will get wiped out in a short while. Perhaps it would already have vanished, as in other parts of the world. But as globalization spreads its influence, it begins to reveal the deep structure of cultural imagination and a renewed interest in the traditional systems of knowledge is taking place. So in India now, there's a wonderful research on all these systems that are now being forgotten, should be resurrected. In the field of conservation in India, perhaps the significant moment was in 1984, when the Indian Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage was started. It sort of was a non-government organization, not-for-profit organization, and they became a counter to the Archaeological Survey of India. They were able to look at things differently. They had no baggage of the colonial heritage. Intac focused on its attention on conserving the unprotected heritage. So we learned a lot about how heritage is seen as monuments, protected. Now they looked at unprotected. Now, just as a statistics, the ASI protects 3,600 monuments in India. Now that's wonderfully laughable, you know. A country of 5,000 years produces only 3,600 monuments. And, you know, that's all they preserve. What about the rest? So the Intact took it on as the agenda to look after the rest, which is hundreds of thousands of other buildings. So in a way, the canvas that Intact took on itself was much larger. It enabled itself to see heritage differently, but also in practice differently. They realized that in India, both the historic building and the historic ways of building constitute the architectural heritage of the country, which would otherwise accommodate the aspirations to develop and modernize built heritage. Like everywhere else in earlier, tradition developed, you became modern, and that's how people evolved. But somehow modernity taught us that modernity begins when history ends. And that idea has somehow seeped into a lot of the ideology of conservation now, that we got to preserve the past as though to say it is to be completely protected. These experiences were collated in 2004 as the Chart of the Conservation of Unprotected Architectural Heritage and Sites in India. And very interestingly, we have Mr. Vinod Daniel here, who was also part of the dialogue to produce this charter. The Intact Charter recognizes the role of the local master builder and the traditional knowledge systems by permitting rebuilding, restoring, renewing, remaking, making additions and alterations to legally protected historic buildings, particularly where credible opportunities exist. It valued the exact replacement, restoration, and rebuilding under several different defined circumstances, since it ensured the continuity of traditional building practices. It permitted conjectural restorations in certain circumstances by privileging the imperatives of the cyclical view of time, by prioritizing the legitimacy of the artistic intent of the builder over the objectives of preserving the linear view of time. Now, the whole idea of the charter was, how can this diversity be ordered and controlled? If it structured the fact that the philosophies and practices of artificial conservation of both the East and the West have their roots in India, but it privileged the local traditions because it says, let the ASI look after its domain, we look after the others. And that's how the charter evolved, that it does not want to meddle with the Taj Mahals and the World Heritage, because those are already been looked after. But the hundreds of other buildings that can be looked after, where traditional craftsmen can be encouraged. They can be allowed to rebuild. They can be allowed to imitate. And hence the objectives of the traditional systems would be conserved. So it also accepted the fact that the objective of conservation as a development tool to mediate the future of the built environment. So this was the important thing. The conservation is not really about preservation. It is about development. And this, we could take the liberty of saying that because we're not talking about the legally protected monuments. We're talking about the many other things that are anyway vanishing. So one could work on that. But the Intact Charter is still a work in progress. The power asymmetries of globalization means that its rationale has few advocates, even among the growing cadre of conservation professionals, which are my own students. I have few advocates even amongst my students because they go to the West, learn the Western way and come back and tell me, look, you're doing something wrong. And that's not right. But this is the power asymmetries of globalization. Consequently, a default transformation of the cultural landscape unmediated by profession is taking place. So these are some of the examples I will just show you about these way it's happening. Example is the Varanasi. Varanasi is the iconic city of India, but it's not protected by ASI. It is really amazing city. But the present government said that we got to modernize it. So how do they modernize it? They demolish about 100 acres and rebuild a completely new avenue. And that's conservation as far as they're concerned. So this is also happening. In the heart of Varanasi, the Vishwanathan Project begins to reconstruct the city according to what models? And it's a very interesting thing. The architect, Bimal Patel, who talks about it, he explains his lecture by saying that I'm following the Vitruvian principles of design. And I said, Mr. Patel, what does Vitruvius have to do with Benares? But there it is. So this is also happening. Or on the other hand, we talked about the Aga Khan, who are doing a lot of curatorial conservation, which the ASI is not doing, which based on evidence. They're doing excellent work of restoring and conserving a work that is done perfectly scientifically, approved by the World Monument Funds, World Heritage sites. So this is on Humayun's Tomb, which is a World Heritage site, where they're doing a lot of restoration work. So this is also happening because, as I said, that tradition is also very much a part of our culture. And in the Humayun's Tomb complex, they're rebuilding or reconstructing buildings, but based on evidence, what you call the curatorial management of heritage. They're doing that. On the other hand, there are a lot of inventive restoration taking place. This is a fort palace in Rajasthan, Nibrana, in a ruined state, in a reconstructed state, imaginatively, etc., but using craftsman materials, techniques, etc. Now, whether we call this conservation or not, or development, is something that we are going to come to terms with. I will certainly not call it an example of conservation, but it's certainly a good example of conserving traditional systems of building. And that also, as I said, in India is an important objective, because not only must the building be conserved, but the system of building must be conserved. And this example, Kavita already showed you about this Kailashnath temple being restored in by using sthapatis and engineers and all that. And she didn't show you the details. Also, I'm not showing it, but they used very high technology to repair this building. And but the local society is very happy. It's been restored, and their temple is back to living. And so this is also an example of what is happening. So this is the scene. Now, what does one? How does one deal with it? Kavita Singh sort of brought out the problems, because the right wing is also of the political right wing is also appropriated it, and conservators also saying that we must do it. Now, how do I reconcile that? So here, in my written paper, I'm not able to articulate because it's a rather complex philosophical idea. But in my written paper, I've argued that Paul Ricoeur asked a very important question. How do traditional societies modernize and retain their culture? Does modernization mean that you're going to give up your culture and become a modern society? So that Paul Ricoeur's question has been in the back of my mind for quite some time, that how do I manage to modernize my system of building and yet conserve it? And there, in my written paper, I just say that there are two ideas of conserving. And again, he quotes Ricoeur to say that there's the Latin term for idem ipse. Idem means keeping the same as same. Ipse means keeping the same as it develops. So it is a clue in there that how can I retain the past and yet develop it? And that Ricoeur's statement, as I said, it's not in my presentation here, but in my written paper I had mentioned it, that there are clues. I don't have any answers. I come here not with an answer, but saying that these are questions that we have been exploring, and it is possible that it can be done. Anupam showed that example of Banaras, done long ago, 1980s. We said something, completely abandoned. But 40 years later, they're doing it again. So it is happening. 30, 40 years later, people are still doing things that we said in 1980s, this is the way to do it. So things might happen, might still happen. So the Intact Charter is a model for an Indian Charter for conservation. It addresses the specificities of the Indian condition and follows the precedents set by the earlier ECOMOS initiatives that formulated the context-specific charters like the Bara Charter or the Nara Document of Authenticity. So of course, I don't think the power asymmetries will ever accept that statement, but this is the model that I have in mind, that the Indian Charter could also have a charter that would evolve from the specificities of the Indian condition. So thank you. I think that was my presentation.
Thank you very much. We have some time for questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Menon. I have a question. You mentioned that the Intact Charter was developed and you spoke about its characteristics, and you said that it was not accepted. Not accepted.
The conservation community, the government, the people in general. See, as I said, as I think Peter mentioned earlier, I'm outside the system. So in a way, I have cut the ground from under my feet. I got no place to stand. No one listens to me. But yet I'm saying this is what I'm saying, that we have to have this charter. We have to construct this system. But my students are not listening to me. The government is not listening to me. ASI is not listening to me. And yet, as I showed you examples, things are happening. We have Banaras happening. We have Humayun's tomb happening. We have temple reconstruction going on. We've got all kinds of things that are happening. At some point, as a professional, I feel that all these things have to be brought into some kind of a metric, some kind of a idea. Either that or let it go by default and let it vanish slowly, which will happen. It will vanish slowly if you don't do it. But I'm saying if you begin to look at it as a process that is happening, maybe we can conserve something. Maybe my grandchildren will be able to say, okay, this is the way you used to build, because that system of building is still available.
And what do you see as the difference, and maybe a difference of sort of positionality, but between an intact charter, which you seem to speak well of in terms of what principles it embodies, versus an Indian charter?
Yeah, well, I was told very clearly that I can't speak for India. So I spoke, yes, I think you can answer that, but I said I can talk about intact because I'm part of intact, so I can talk about intact charter. That who can challenge me? Yes, I can't, no one can. Yes, I think you know that.
No, there isn't. I know, but he's saying about the proposing an Indian charter.
I think we know that point.
Yeah, maybe just to add to what Professor Menon was saying, basically the Venice Charter is accepted as the global document. Australia modified that again, from a national perspective, and that's how the Bara Charter came. And China actually got the China principles again based on that. So the initial thought was to, basically go to the Venice Charter, use some of these other examples, but make it more localized, and that's where intact really got involved. But there was no direct government person, within the whole group or their blessings. And I think that's probably, what I interpret is there.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. You made a very startling comment that, and which is true, and yet it's startling that as professional architects only build 10% of the buildings in India, and 90% is built by. And it seems from listening to the presentations in the morning, a lot of conservation also takes place within that unprofessional or
90%. Yeah.
90%. So there is a correlationship between architecture and conservation in that respect. So what is this? So what is your overview of conservation in India? So there is a parallel conservation technique which we might not recognize as conservation, which is probably Disney World or whatever. So irrespective of what we think about it, and we have very little agency over that. So there is a different logic of conservation taking place, as there is a different logic of architecture taking place in India. So how would you describe Indian conservation in that context?
You see, right now there is no one to make that statement, no one to answer your question, because no one is thinking about it. ASI is saying this, how to do conservation. The local people are saying this, the way we want to do conservation. Everyone is saying what they want to do. And that's some of I just took a few examples there, I could give many other examples of how local societies are conserving their buildings, I just felt that those have to be somehow collated and some kind of sense had to be made out of that. And yet it has to deal with modernity and modernization and the future. To answer Rikova's question, can a traditional society like India, modernize by conserving its past, its values, etc., and still modernize and not give up the past? But we are going very much, if you look at the Banaras example, that's exactly what they're doing. So these are some of the challenges.
May I add a bit? I think intact is paying for some of its sins in some ways, because it took on restoration or conservation of non-protected, and as you mentioned, there's a huge number of them. And in the process, it sort of liberalized who could conserve. And that has turned into a problem, because everyone at every stage thinks that they can conserve and they know how to conserve. And because there's no system to rein that in, there's a democracy, there's an election system in the organization. So at some point, they've created a monster, I think.
Well, in answer to the question, if you read the charter very carefully, it says very clearly who can do what and where. I didn't get into it because that gets into far greater detail, but there are about 8 or 10 clauses to the charter, and they begin what to conserve, how to conserve, etc. It's all being answered in a very systematic way. In other words, you can't have a free-for-all. The charter very clearly says we're not advocating a free for all. If a Tamil Nadu temple has to be conserved with Sapathis, it recognizes that as a category. But there are hundreds of categories. So those categories have to be defined. We can't just say the problem is too much, let's not do it, let anything happen. No, we're not saying that. We're saying we have to begin to make some sense out of our cultural diversity. See, one of the things that modernity has done is that it has homogenized thinking. I'm saying, no, can we have diversity as a model? Can we have many things as a model? In the process, we might make mistakes, but that's human to err. And so can we accept that as a philosophical idea, if not as a aesthetic idea?
So I'm going to take the last question myself and dot the I with it. And that is, why are you against preserving ruins as ruins?
Not at all. The Intact Charter says very clearly that important ruins must remain as important ruins. The Sarnath temple, as I told you, I would dare not touch it. I would dare not advocate it should be touched. It is too much an important part of history. So that should be kept as a ruin. But for ASI to say that that should govern everything is what I'm challenging. I value the fact that I have a European background. You know, the European idea of romanticizing a ruin is also part of my culture. I've also been civilized. I've also been taught to admire it, and I value it. I don't say that, oh, now I'm going to give it all up. It is an absurd, nihilistic way of proceeding. We want to deny your past. It is very much a part of my colonialism is very much a part of my past. Eurocentrism is very much a part of my past. And I value it. But I'm saying that Eurocentrism should not determine everything about our culture. And that the charter says very clearly, this is how to distinguish it. How to conserve, where to conserve, and who will conserve is been very clearly defined.
I guess I would underscore the idea that preserving India's historic heritage is Eurocentric. And that's, I think, a questionable judgment, which we can talk about later, but to stay on schedule, we have to
Thank you.
congratulate you on